We will continue with Andrea Feldman, Professor Andrea Feldman, who received her PhD in history from Yale University. She's Associate Professor of History at the University of Zagreb, the School of Teachers Education, and Associate Professor of History and Diplomacy at the Sarajevo School of Science and Technology in Bosnia and Herzegovina.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation. It is really very good and interesting to be here and see some old friends that I haven't seen in a while, and also hopefully make some new. When I got this invitation, there was an issue about, what are we going to discuss, really? And I had a few ideas about it. So let me just start by saying that after almost 30 years of transition to democracy, Croatia has not improved dramatically levels of political participation of women. A lot of time passed since the fall of the Berlin Wall and Croatia's War of Independence, and even though the transition resulted in varied developments in countries that bid farewell to communism and embraced liberal democracy and the rule of law, the political representation of women by women has not increased. It is where it was in the last days of the communist rule. Although the expectations were high, certainly on a part of feminists who wanted to exchange the false universalism of communist solutions to the questions of women with genuine gender equality, it has not happened. The percentages of women representatives in parliament remains at best around 23%, which is, I believe, the global average. The comparison is, of course, possible with the endeavors of feminists in different parts of disintegrating Yugoslavia at the end of it, in the 90s, and their attempts to ensure not only the continuation of achieved rights, but hoped for improvement of the women's political representation in the successor states of former Yugoslavia. It was also possible to discuss the changes in position and the role of women as a part of the communist revolution that took part in Yugoslavia during the Second World War and in its aftermath. But I realize that there are colleagues here who are focused on that question, so I shall refrain from doing so. I would like to examine this question by using a historical comparison to another transition, that of dissolution of Austria-Hungary, and the attempts to change the election law in Croatia in 1918, as well as the experience of the First World War and the expectations of a small but determined number of feminist and suffrage activists from the area. Therefore, I'm going to focus today on three issues. One, I'm going to talk about an exceptional woman intellectual who was at the same time a feminist activist. Second, I will try to analyze the attempt to change or influence the election law in 1917. And third, I will try to talk about the transition to the new Yugoslav state and the beginning of women's movement at the same time. So let us start with part one. Zofka Kveder. I think we can show the illustration. I'm not going to insist on it. We'll just put it on like a slideshow. It contains nothing but the images of her. Zofka Kveder published this very intriguing text in 1917, and I quote, "During the war, Yugoslav woman had indeed little to say in public about what she wanted, what her thoughts were. Our circumstances pushed us into a deep silence. The war came down on us with its iron fists, so that it sometimes felt as if our thoughts were frozen inside our heads. Men were silenced, women were silenced. Our whole nation sank into silence, into unspeakable, painful apathy. We lay down facing earth. Powerful and fearful winds blew above us, and heavy and reckless feet stumbled over our hearts. But the nation cannot stay still for years. The yearning for freedom, for outspoken and public expression of thoughts and feelings cannot be suffocated for years. When the first ray of hope and better times shone over dark wartime skies, we came alive as the earth comes alive into spring. What sweetness it was to think, what relish it was to freely utter one's thoughts, to speak out loudly and fearlessly one's longings and one's hopes. And I unquote here. This excerpt, of course, may have been written in the 1990s and even in 1940s. But this was, in fact, a statement, a part of a program published in the first feminist journal in Croatia in 1917. Its editor and founder was Zofka Kveder, a Slovenian journalist, writer, and an early feminist activist, whose feminist and socialist cosmopolitanism abjured any kind of national demands if they were not in the service of Yugoslav unitarism and unification, which she, like many other Yugoslav nationalists, considered a revolutionary act in itself. She was born here in Ljubljana, in a family of a railway worker, a father who was not only frequently absent, but also an alcoholic. Her letters to her mother reveal a traumatized, lonely, and scared young woman trying to come to terms with demands that life had put before this teenager. "I'm alone," she said. "I'm afraid of myself, of the world, and of life," unquote. She was educated at the elementary school outside of Ljubljana and returned to Ljubljana to attend Lichtenturn Institute, all-girls high school run by nuns. Although she did not graduate because she fled Ljubljana, first to work for an attorney's office and then for Trieste, where she started to work at the post office. In Trieste, which was at the time center of Slovene national activities, she found a place at the editorial office of the journal Edinost, Unity, and the journal Slovenka, Slovenian Woman, indeed the first Slovenian journal devoted to women's issues. Concerned about the state of women workers and about the education of women, as well about her own education, she traveled to Switzerland, where she enrolled at the University of Zurich and Bern. She supported herself by writing in German and continued her travels to Munich and Prague, where she met an inspiring writer, Vladimir Jelovšek, who was also a medical student and whom she married. The years she spent in Prague proved fertile, since she published several of her books there, most notably Mystery žene, The Mystery of Women, which was at the time harshly criticized by Slovene literary critics because of her focus on violence, pain, and exploitation of women. When Jelovšek graduated in 1906, she moved to Zagreb. In Zagreb, Zofka Kveder became the editor of the Frauenzeitung, women's paper, a supplement to the German-language Zagreb newspaper Agramer Tagblatt, which earned her a certain prominence in Zagreb intellectual circles and Slovene and Croatian women's movement as well. She traveled extensively in the countries of Southeast and Central Europe, developing a network of contacts with prominent women of the time, like Marta Tausk, a wife of Viktor Tausk, an unfortunate student of Freud. And she herself was a social democrat activist. Unhappy in her marriage, Zofka did not know how to handle her husband's unfaithfulness and tried to commit suicide before divorcing him in 1911. Several years later, in 1914, she married Juraj Demetrović, a publicist and a politician. and from a very early age, a member of the Social Democratic Party of Croatia, Slavonia, and a fervent advocate of Yugoslav unitarism. After the First World War, he joined Svetozar Pribičević, the most influential Serbian politician in Croatia, Slavonia, and was elected in 1920 a member of Constitutional Assembly of the new state. After the introduction of Vidovdan Constitution, he was the king's representative for Croatia, Slavonia. Close to Pribičević, he joined him and Stjepan Radić, the Croatian peasant party leader, in the oppositional Peasant Democratic Coalition in 1927, but during the January 6 dictatorship of King Alexander, Demetrović supported the dictatorship and entered the government at ministerial level. All this did not make him popular in Zagreb, and even though Demetrović fell into marked disrepute in the 1930s, Zovka suffered ostracism in Zagreb social and journalist circles much earlier and was frequently subject of criticism and ridicule. The death of her oldest daughter, who died in Spanish fever during her studies at Prague University, worsened her health condition, and her husband's unfaithfulness proved too difficult to handle. She committed suicide on November 21st, 1926, and was buried at Zagreb Mirogoj Cemetery, where 3 women, a Slovene, a Croat, and a Serb, spoke at her funeral. Her tragic end notwithstanding, Zovka Kveder was a prominent figure in Zagreb literary and social circles. In a story about her, written for the Ilustrovani List, illustrated journal, she was presented as a, quote, very energetic, self-reliant, and emancipated woman, unquote, a model of modern intellectual who contributed greatly to Croatia's women's movement. Zovka Kveder proved that by founding a women's journal in September of 1917. It had a rather general name, Ženski svijet, Women's World, a monthly for cultural, social, and political interests of women. 2 years later, Zovka Kveder claimed that she wanted to call it Yugoslav woman, Jugoslavenska žena, from the very beginning, but as she explained, and I quote, name at first had to be harmless enough not to attract unnecessary attention of the Austrian-Hungarian rulers, and unquote. And this is true. If you read it, the first several copies of it, you can note these blank spots that were basically subject to censorship. In her programmatic text, Zovka Kveder, and the text was called, the first text was called What Do We Want? Što hoćemo? Zovka Kveder assessed the position of women in the circumstances of the First World War. And I quote, to the heroism of men who went to the front responded heroism of women who stayed at home. It was gender equality brought about by suffering, and I unquote. This was, of course, a general argument, and that argument was shared with pretty much every feminist suffragist organization or activist in Europe, and I think globally at the time. And I have here another quote of her from the same text, which goes, that equality that came at such a high price has to be, not only in hard times, but also in good times, the first acquis of the new times and the new life, which has begun to arise amongst the ruins of the old. Women should not be a second-class being just because she is a woman. During this awful war, unlike any previous time, she has shown her value. She has testified with her actions that she was indeed a pillar of society. She took as her own the thought of humanity. Where there was pain, there was a woman to relieve it. Women were everywhere among the first to discuss the establishment of common human community. She was obviously, in her journal, one can notice an interest into the peace process, the way how this is going to develop, because obviously the war was still not over, and a very committed way in which she advocated for Yugoslav unitarism and unification. So there was obviously talk about the progress, and both Zofka Kveder and most of her co-workers combined it and compared it and basically brought it together as the development and progress in general. They all talked about light, happiness, and liberty. But also, there were different issues that were generally more feminist or women-oriented. They were debated and discussed throughout the paper. There were issues of women and their work, the possibilities of opening different professions to women, especially intellectual work, which is quite of interest to me. There is the discussion about the women's equality, her social position, discussions of pay gap, and political rights, obviously. On the other hand, there are issues that are generally considered to be social issues, like issue of abortion, a very frequent debates of alcoholism, which I think are generally disregarded in our societies, but at the time they were quite prominently debated. The debate about prostitution and sexually transmitted diseases, which obviously troubled the generation of the post-war generation. And there were also discussions about what the new age is going to bring to women, what types of social care, what types of political and social equality, what will happen to develop women's movement, but also to development of women as free and capable professionals. So this is how this journal sort of framed the debate on women's issues. One that I will analyze in some detail is the debate about the election law, which is basically something that Zofka herself, debated and discussed, and her programmatic text was written as a part of the political debate that was taking place in Croatian parliament during the most part of the 1970s. The attempts to change the election law in Croatia were important to understand the circumstances at the end of the Austro-Hungary, and to show that women's suffrage was a topic used as a means of political struggle during 1917. The government's proposal for election reform, which was finally accepted by the Croat-Serbian coalition majority in Croatian Sabor, left women in Croatia without suffrage. At the parliamentary session of December 13, 1917, arguments were presented against the women's suffrage by the members of the government coalition. That means the people in power. Vyacheslav Weidler, member of Napredna Stranka, the Progressive Party, reported to the parliament that there were several suggestions, however innocent and weak, as he said, to introduce women's suffrage in Croatia. He acknowledged that the arguments were without a doubt strong and powerful, especially for small nations that are in need of assembling the whole nation and take care of each and every unit of the nation, and women represent a half and maybe more of the whole population. He repeated the already well-known argument and that was the argument of women's participation in the war efforts, which was previously discussed not only by women themselves, but also by an oppositional leader, Stjepan Radic, the president of a Croatian peasant party, who publicly advocated for women's suffrage ever since 1910. Aside from social democrats, Stjepan Radic was the only politician in Croatia who, at this early stage, understood the importance of women for democratic and party mobilization. The Croatian Peasant Party, therefore, was the first party that invited women to participate at the sessions of its main assembly beginning in August of 1910. Also, during and after the First World War, he was the one that argued that women, mostly peasant women, really proved their worth by managing to save the peasant estates during the war, the First World War. In 1917, on the other hand, representatives of the governing Croat-Serb coalition, like the Podban or vice governor Vinko Krišković, an influential liberal and a Democrat elected to parliament on the list of Croat United Independent Party, thought it impossible to implement such a demand. His reasoning was that although women's suffrage cannot be denied, and I quote, from the ethical nor theoretical point of view, the theoretical and ethical viewpoints are not the only ones that matter in politics, unquote. Since he thought it took English more than a century to debate that issue, Krišković's pragmatic view was that it was too early for such a huge reform. On the other hand, the members of Starčević's perpetually oppositional party of state right, so-called Milinovci, in general supported women's suffrage, albeit with a certain census. Their representative, Cesar Akačić, quoted John Stuart Mill in his address to the parliament and then proposed that the suffrage should be extended, and I quote, at least to those women of age 24, women of age, that means 24, that one, graduated from high school, two, those that ran a craft shop or a shop on their own, and three, to the widows who run their own estate, unquote. The additional argument in favor of suffrage was the fact that women were already regarded as equal to men in the eyes of a criminal and civil law, so there is no reason not to be equal in the eyes of politics and the constitutional rights. Akačić responded to the argument that no seizable women's movement developed in Croatia, with a special mention of Zagorka, Marija Jurić Zagorka, a prominent woman journalist who enjoyed immense popularity and whose engagement on the part of women's rights was appreciated by the representatives of the opposition. He also nodded to Zovka Kveder's journal, and I quote, I have read recently in Ženski Svijet, Women's World, a nice article of Madame Zagorka, where she states, and with right, that Croat women was of tremendous help to Croat men in their national struggle. And then a voice from the audience, long live Zagorka, that she encouraged men to persist and not to give up the struggle for national rights. I know that we will not succeed in our demands today, but I also know that the day is near when in Croatia women will be equal in all their political and constitutional rights to men, because it will not be possible, not even for Croatia, to resist the new democratic spirit of the age. And I unquote here. Another discussant, Aleksandar Horvat, who was leader of the pure party of state right, countered the argument about non-existence of the women's movements in Croatia. He claimed that such an argument was, and I quote, too westernizing. The movement for suffrage presupposes that national and political circumstances in a certain state or nation are regulated or settled. And I unquote, the circumstances of life of Slavs were such that women and men acted mostly together to achieve general as well as national objectives. He gives an example to the extended family life of the South Slavs, as well as Russian village community Mir, and claims that women were equal members of those communities, and in many cases ran those communities. He also compared the French and Russian revolutions, claiming that for all its ideas of humanity, French Revolution remained anti-feminist in its scope. revolutionary Russia understands the achievements of women's rights as self-evident and is therefore considered as ethically superior. The demand for introduction of the separate women's movement on the Roman or German model, and one that would be different from the existing demands of national rights that are shared by women and men of Croatia alike, will not serve the common good. And here I quote, "Our ideal was for women not to lead their own separate politics, but to take part, collaborate, and help as co-fighters in general national cause. The common struggle for the national and social progress that was the wish of our women ever since they started their engagement. Why to force them now to take another route?" And I unquote. Horvat was certain that the debates on suffrage in Croatian parliament will have a great value for women. They will be able to extract a lot from it. They will learn that in theory, all the political parties supported the suffrage, but in practice, not all routes are cleared. The issue of suffrage will remain on the agenda and debated in public until, and I quote, "the enemies of that demand of modern democracy capitulate in front of consciousness, agility, and propaganda of progressive women. The betrayed hopes of women should energize all progressive women to promote the thought of political equality in our nation so that the shameful state of inequality disappears as soon as possible. More political interest and more propaganda, that is the balance sheet of the debate on suffrage in Croatian parliament. Let the deeds of women speak for themselves." And I unquote here. As the editor-in-chief, Zofka Kveder understood the complementarity of women's and national question. As a part of the public debate and campaign for the change of electoral law, the Ženski Svijet published information about the state of women and women's suffrage in Europe and in the US. It stresses in particular the fact that in Hungary, Dr. Sándor Vekerle, the Prime Minister of Hungary, expressed his own positive view of women's suffrage. And I quote, "not only because women need it, but because he believed that the participation in public life will be beneficial to the Hungarian nation." And I unquote. And let me jump now, because I don't really want to overdo my time, jump now on the situation in the November of 1918. When the November issue was already ready to go to printers, the extraordinary event changed the course of history in Croatia. As the First World War was entering its final period, with the collapse of the fronts and the general disarray in Austro-Hungary, in October 1918, the Croatian Sabor parliament declared independence of Austria and Hungary, trying to establish control over the South Slavic provinces in the tottering Habsburg state. This was difficult without international recognition and in the face of Italian disembarkment on the eastern Adriatic coast and the slow Serbian military occupation. The National Committee, which the Sabor elected as an administrative body, succumbed under the pressures and sent a delegation to Belgrade, where the unification with Serbia was proclaimed in December 1918. November issue of Kveder's journal already had a new title, Jugoslavenska žena, Yugoslav woman. The subtitle also changed, and adjective Yugoslav was inserted. And in the first pages of the new edition, there was Zofka's text. And I quote, "Today the old is destroyed and we women have to go forward. Look ahead for our most beautiful aim, the unification of Yugoslavs. Let us work sincerely with all that enthusiasm and self-sacrifice a woman's heart is capable of. Work for that grand idea that was saved us from the centennial slavery. Let us not be petty. Let us not think only about our interest of our tribes. It is not enough, O Serbian woman, to feel Serbian today. You have to be Yugoslav. You are not a Croat. You are not a true patriot if you are only Croat and not a Yugoslav. And you, O Slovenian woman, forget your provincial patriotism and be a true daughter of unified, free Yugoslavia. She went on, and of course, expressing admiration for President Wilson and so on and so on. But it was not for too long, since even after the act of unification, women started to advocate for suffrage soon after the establishment of the new state. And on Sunday, February 22nd, in 1919, there was a women's assembly organized in a Metropole cinema in Zagreb that drew, as the paper informed, quite a crowd. 6 women of diverse political backgrounds, from Democrats to Socialists, some of which were representatives of school teachers, the other of workers, spoke at the meeting specifying different aspects of the still unresolved issue of women's suffrage. Zofka Kveder was among those that spoke, and actually she spoke twice, and emphasized disadvantages of the legal status of women. And she asserted, I have to say with some disenchantment, and I quote, "On the very first day of our liberation and unification that we longed for such a long time, on October 29, 1918, which women greeted with joyful enthusiasm, Yugoslavia wronged against women for the first time." And I quote, "when they denied them political representation, unlike other European nations, unlike Russians, Czechs, Germans, and Hungarians." I quote, "Only Yugoslavs circumvented women, with an exception of Novi Sad in Vojvodina, where women enjoyed a passive voting right and were elected to the local national council. Today's women have responsibility not to fight only for themselves, but also for the future generations, and they have to demand political rights in the name of their daughters and granddaughters." Unquote. There was a resolution accepted by the Assembly which stated that in the new circumstances of liberation and unification, women demand suffrage and equal rights with all the other citizens of the new state. And I quote, "because when we do all our duties, we should be given all the rights," unquote. Women proved by working that they are perfectly capable to carry on their back all burdens which in the previous patriarchal age men carried for them. They demanded to be consulted even before the first elections for the Constitutional Assembly and not to be forgotten, and I quote, "because we will not rest until our human rights are achieved." And let me cross now to just a few months ahead, in the September of 1919, where the first, indeed, Congress of Yugoslav women was held in Belgrade. Zofka Kveder was there, and her journal published an extensive report about the Congress, which was quite interesting and basically showed the variety of interest and variety of issues that I spoke about. But I will really just mention a few. First of all, she herself said that the Congress was very strenuous because very diverse elements and temperaments were represented. Women from all regions of our beautiful and unified homeland came. There were women of all walks of life, of different ages, from honorable matron in national costume to young lady in latest outfit from Paris, from a peasant woman to university student and a professor. Women from all political parties. Next to the old fanatical Serbian radical, I saw sitting a young and fierce communist. Next to a tolerant Yugoslav, there is a separatist former supporter of Starčević party. Remember, the party that supported suffrage. And still, all these have somehow settled, understood each other, and came together. Zofka Kveder-Demetrović left the Congress with a strong conviction that this was a manifestation of women's maturity for parliamentary life. Women told many real stories about their work. They collected many serious resolutions and suggestions, and there were many excellent and fabulous speakers. But there were also already at that first Congress issues that indicated the possibility of rupture, that were basically tearing apart this proclaimed unity. First of all, the issue of name. The Congress was called the Congress of Yugoslav Women, but in its statutes and other papers, it was referred to as a Congress of Women of the state or kingdom of Slovenes, Croats, and Serbs. So the name Yugoslav, although Zofka Kveder really sort of offered it, and she sort of put up the amendment to basically change the name of the Congress, it did not work. Already, it was clear that there were different ideas about what actually constituted the Yugoslav Union. And the second question, which I found quite interesting, was that they already had a big fight over who is going to be a president of the Congress. And one of the participants basically suggested that from now on, for the whole eternity, the Serbian woman should be a president of the Congress. Because, of course, and then the usual arguments about the First World War, Serbian suffering, and all the problems that they had to face along the time. So I would just like to sort of quickly add here that there were obviously different views of the Congress itself. Zofka was very positive and had high hopes for it, but the different papers, especially in Zagreb, reported differently on the Congress. The one, and actually quite not likely person that criticized the Congress was aforementioned Zagorka, the journalist for the Jutarnji List, the morning paper in Zagreb, who in Zofka's view was too subjective. She obviously reported the things that were not to Zofka's liking. And the second quite interesting reaction, which I want to mention, was the reaction of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia. The Communist Party of Yugoslavia was still, at the time, a legal party, and they reported that this was a Congress of the ladies with fine complexions. So there was a certain, let us say, class view of this Congress. Let me conclude now. The developments of 1918 in many ways showed the women's movement in its purest form in comparison to transitions that we will see in 1945 and 1990s. Women were fighting for the tangible reform of suffrage rights, which Austro-Hungary denied them and which many Habsburg successor states accepted as a democratic reform, thereby providing women a place at the table of political representation. Women like Zofka Kveder were enthusiastic supporters of Yugoslav unification, itself an ideological entrance card at the time, but failed to garner wider support on the issue. Unlike in 1990s, 91, when suffrage was a matter of abandoning the communist monopoly in the electoral process and not a pure women's issue, or in 1945, when all changes and reforms were filtered by the communist dictatorship, in 1918, the cause was clear, and clearly women's, and the means tangible and real. Yet, the new Yugoslav state, which was conceived in inequality, behaved consistently on the issue of suffrage, denying equality to women too. We can conclude that in 1918, the concept of citizenship was maintained in the case of the triunine nation of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, but even there, with variation in practice to the exclusion of many minorities, most notably Jews, Hungarians, and Germans. And then, as we have seen, to all women. The newly established state institutions and documents ignored women, their issues, and gender equality in equal measure, as they notoriously ignored national and confessional equality in the state, noted for national and religious pluralism. The women themselves, particularly after the issue of suffrage equality was lost, fought for their rights in various marginal parties, mainly on the left, but also as a part of this united women's movement that will take place during the interwar period. But even here, the Communist Party being a good example, women were poorly represented in the leadership. For instance, as late as 1940, at the 5th Land Conference of the Communist Party, of 101 delegates, only 8 were women, and of that number, only 2 had high party functions, and they were Spacenija Cana Babović, Organizational Secretary of Serbia, and Vida Tomšić, a member of Slovenian Central Committee. These 2 were the only women elected by the 5th Land Conference into the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia, the body that had 30 members and 16 candidate members. Compared with that, one can reassess today's position of women in Croatian political life and claim that 23% elected MPs and almost 50% of elected members of European Parliament, as well as one first directly elected women president of the Republic of Croatia, are the signs of quite an advancement in political representation. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your wonderful paper. And maybe I will start with one little question, which is maybe also interesting for participants and from other countries. In your presentation of the debate in the parliament, it was implicitly, if not explicitly, outspoken one issue. The issue about the fear how women will vote if they will gain this right. Which were the major fears in this sense from the part of various politicians? And
I think it was pretty similar to other countries in Europe at the time. And I think that the arguments were quite similar. First, you had the sort of list of arguments claiming that women were subjective, that they were too emotional, that they are not knowledgeable enough, and so on and so on. But I think at the moment at which we debated now, it was quite clear that these examples were not really that arguments were not valid. So the sense overall on the floor of the parliament was that women are capable of voting. But the major fear was, and this is precisely why the Croatian Peasant Party leader Stjepan Radić supported women's suffrage, the fear was that the peasants will vote for the peasant party. And women, members of peasant families, which were overwhelmingly population of Croatia at the time, will obviously bring Stjepan Radić to power. And this was, although one can discuss Stjepan Radić, who was quite a character and very controversial in his many, incarnations, political incarnations, but he was a pro-feminist, pro-suffrage ever since his very early times. He studied in Prague. He had a Czech wife who herself was quite politically active, and he saw, the possibility for advancing his cause through the women activism. And the argument that I mentioned about the First World War and a tremendous loss of life, which of course was in Croatia as tragic as everywhere else, also indicated that women were left with a certain power inside of the family, especially on the peasant estates, and it was quite clear that the suffrage was the thing that is going to happen. So, he wanted to be there to basically profit of it.
Yeah, but
Yeah. Glenda. Yes. Thank you.
And also learning about Suffrage better, and that image of her son.
That she had 3 daughters, and
You can just see they just want to go out and play and not listen to her. Anyway. So you describe her as cosmopolitan, and I think that there might be interesting connections between that international plane and the national, well, regional.
Mm-hmm.
And so I started thinking of the whole Habsburg context. So thinking of Zika Schwimmer, who's coming out of the Hungarian context in the same period, and a founding member of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom that becomes a really important actor, as you know, in this international context.
Yes.
And then I was thinking also of the coincidence of as in chronological timing coincidence, of the meeting in Zagreb in February 1919 and the meeting in Zurich of the international women's movements in parallel in Paris, trying to influence what's going on. And I'm wondering if it's not on Sophie's part and those feminists in that Yugoslav context of consciousness of their networks, their cosmopolitan networks, with these other movements of people, are they influenced? And also, is the cosmopolitanism that you're describing one where her sense of, we've got to go past our tribes and become Yugoslav? Is that part of a thinking about an internationalist thinking as well? Does it fit into the internationalism of people like Schwimmer in that period? And then I was thinking, the Habsburg context is also the Masaryk and his wife is translating, which is American, translating Wilson into Czech, and then Schwimmer translating Wilson into Hungary. So is your story part of that international story at all?
I don't know if my story is, but I think that that women that were engaged in the demand for suffrage were definitely part of the international activism, and their networks were known, they were public. And frequently at odds with the local politics, with the local circumstances. And of course, the situation at the end of the Austro-Hungary was, as you described, there were parts of the movement from Austria, the Rozikaš women from Hungary. The problem with the Croatian side of it was that they were virtually forced out of it. There was an incident in 1915 in which quite a big number of Croatian women, different walks of life, but mostly sort of a part of what was considered to be a middle class movement, demanded that at the conference in The Hague, 1915, the representatives for Croatia should be Zofka Kveder and another woman, Zlata Lopašić-Kovačević. And the fact was that they actually collected money for their trip, and they actually got, which is really funny, support and donations from even very prominent Catholic church figures, like the Archbishop of Zagreb at the time, some other male intellectuals as well. But the government denied them passports, and that was a Croatian government. It was not the Hungarian side, which actually advocated for them to get their passport, but, this was the government that decided against it. And when I think of them at the moment, I thought that, and I think this was, Zagreb is a tiny place today, and it was even smaller in the beginning of century. I think this was a common knowledge all around the city, what they were doing, what they were trying to advocate, and, who were their supporters and who were the opponents. So I don't think that was a secret of sorts. As for the Yugoslav issue, that I think is a completely different. And I think in the interwar period, there will develop a women's movement or a feminist movement that is along the line of what one of these representatives was criticizing, the Western type of women's movement, which basically resembled the international women's movement in the manner that it existed. And there are all kinds of problems with there as well, because this obviously was not so unified as some of the members of it would have liked it to be. Yeah.
Thank you. I also have a question that links to the legacy of the Habsburg Empire, but more specifically, I think you said that Zofka spent time in Trieste, and I was wondering to what extent she and other suffrage activists in Croatia and Slovenia were interested in the fate of Slovenians and Croats living under Italian rule in Trieste or Istria after the war, both before and after 1922 when Mussolini took power, both in a gendered sense, that there's no votes for women in Italy, and in a national sense, that both the liberal and fascist Italian states interned Croat and Slovenian national activists.
If you ask me about Zofka herself, I mean, she was obviously somebody that grew up during the Habsburg times, and she herself, I think, in many ways was a sort of a typical Habsburg product, somebody who knew the languages of the Habsburg monarchy, traveled extensively all around Habsburg monarchy, lived in Prague. There is a big body of work that she did and published during her several years that she spent there in Czech language. So she was multilingual in that way that she could easily communicate in the area.
Did I hear right that she spent time in Trieste as well?
She was, as I mentioned, and she was also working for two different journals. One was the journal Edinost, which was a socialist journal, and the other one was Slovenka, which is a Slovenian woman, which was the journal of the Slovenian women in Trieste. But Trieste was basically the cultural center of, and political, I would say, of Slovenes during this last years of Habsburg monarchy. So she definitely, matured and, grew up and matured in that circumstance. But Yugoslav unitarism was something that she picked up on the way, combined with her socialist beliefs, which she does not espouse so openly as Yugoslav nationalism, but still we know that it was there. When it comes to the issues of Mussolini, and I cannot say that I remember, but this is fairly early, so it cannot be really, it cannot be corroborated with her journal, which actually stopped. She stopped publishing it in 1920. So, it was still not the time of, Mussolini's power gains. But what I can, and I have noticed, and this is something that I have to say, to the certain degree surprise, because all of us, and I guess I'm a generation that was brought up in the socialist or communist Yugoslavia, and where many aspects of the interwar period were quite, how they say, painted in a certain way. So I was not aware of the fact that the socialist movement in Yugoslavia, the communist movement in Yugoslavia, was to that degree anti-Semitic. Which, you know, when you normally when you read about the communist movement in Eastern Europe, in Russia, and so on, most of the proponents of it, or a big number, a big majority, are Jews, and you don't really notice it in the same way in Yugoslavia. And this is something that I am quite surprised to say. Also, Zofka Kveder, there were open anti-Semitic attacks on Jewish women, and which is really kind of funny of all things because of their obviously Zionist orientations, but also because of the luxury they exposed in her wardrobe, in their attitude, in their, you know, sort of lifestyle. And this is something that I can follow in the in her writings, in her journal. There was also a debate with another prominent Jewish intellectuals that I'm studying, Vera Ehrlichstein, who kind of debated it on the pages of Yugoslav Woman in 1919. So I think that there are certain, I think, new things that we can find out about these that period of time, and about the whole way in which, you know, both women that were supporting suffrage, you know, how they thought about their life, how they thought about their circumstances, and the circumstances of others.
Okay, thank you. This will be the last question, because I suppose that we are... okay.
Quite covered my question, yes, so yes. I will give it.
No, that's okay.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for your fascinating paper. I was especially interested in hearing about 1917 and the debate in the Croatian Diet or Parliament about suffrage and how much support there was as well. And something I will also mention in the afternoon is interesting for me, that women seem to need a strong politician with power as an ally in parliament to get their ideas through, and evidently this seems to have already been the case in Croatia. So what happened then with the unification? Was this powerful man not able to get this through?
This is a good question. What always happens in politics? I think that there was an issue. First of all, the most vocal proponent, the Radic, still remained the most vocal oppositional leader, and he was, after all, killed on the floors of the Yugoslav Assembly in 1928. I'm not saying this was because of his, feminist views, but definitely he was considered the most, let us say, dangerous proponent of the Croatian politics. And the thing is that the other parties that I mentioned, again, remained splintered and oppositional. So, this is something that was not... The better question would be, what happened with those parties in power that had politicians related to some of the most prominent feminists of the time, and how they, sort of negotiated their kitchen politics at the time when they denied suffrage even in the whole of interwar period. There were several prominent feminists that were closely tied to some of the Serbian politicians of the Radical Party and the Democratic Party. So,
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
We should continue our conversation during lunch.
Great, thank you.
Thank you for all.